to give you a little bit of their own background and to provide their own insight into police use of cameras. And then from there, we'll go into the questions I have prepared. And after that, we'll open it up to audience questions. So, give me a moment. Starting over here, we have Burlington Police Chief Brandon DePozo. Next over, we have an ACLU staff attorney, James Diaz. And at the end, we have Jose Maldonado. He's also a 3L here at Vermont Law School and a former New York City police officer. So we'll start with Chief DePozo. If you want to give us a few moments to...
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to come down here. I passed the law school on the interstate a bunch, so it was good to finally take the exit, come here and meet some of the folks. It's always insightful for me to see how people fill a room. I criticize my cops for never taking the front row seats. They always sit in the back, but I see it's not limited to police officers. It's also law school students as well. So I'm going to go home and tell them that they're in good company. So I've been in Burlington for about 2.5 years. I started September 1st, 2015. Burlington's the largest municipal police force in Vermont. Prior to that, I spent just under 2 decades in the New York City Police Department. I commanded 2 police precincts. I was a beat cop in East Flatbush and Crown Heights. I worked in internal affairs, investigating corruption and brutality. I also spent just under 2 years living in Amman, Jordan, as part of the New York City Police Department's Intelligence Division's International Liaison Program. It gave me the opportunity to respond to the scene of terrorist attacks, unfortunately, but it was instructive around the world and see what we can learn about how to better protect New York that way. I wanted to just say a few things briefly because I think we get a lot of fruitfulness out of the question and answer and the give and take. You know, J. Diaz and I are known for give and take. His boss and my boss say we deserve each other, but I think that we get really, really good, insight from that type of exchange. So just to continue with the keynote speaker, I think one of the things that's interesting to me as a police officer regarding, for example, the encryption problems we encounter getting a philosophy PhD. I do have the en route master's, so I never miss a chance to hold law school students hostage with philosophy. There's this idea in jurisprudence that every container should be subject to search given the right judicial process, that if you can establish probable cause through the right level of judicial review, you're allowed to enter and search a container for evidence of a crime. And then there's an admissibility hearing to see if that review and that search was conducted properly, and you can continue to use the evidence in the proceeding. Now, there's one container of information that might contain probable cause. It's not subject to search. Anyone want to guess what that container is? Humor me, please. Yeah, the human mind. Great, you got it. I think that's clear. Number one, just if you're sticking with the law, that intersects with the Fifth Amendment, right? But the search of the mind is a violation of a Fifth Amendment right. But I think philosophically that makes a lot of sense too, that there's this limit to what we conceive of as a container. So the question then is, what type of container is a cloud that contains an array of electrons that when you interpret them by a convention gives you, something that becomes knowledge? And what type of a container is a phone? Or what is a container that has electrons spread out throughout the world that with an array sitting over them that tells you how to assemble them and give you knowledge? And so I think the court's going to have an interesting time deciding if this is in some way or another an extension of the human mind, or if it is, on the other hand, just a new way of having a file that contains Al Capone's tax evasion that you lock up and stick in a safe in the back of a barber shop in Chicago, but instead it's just cut up into a million pieces and spread around the world. And I think that our understanding of that is going to shape the course of these cases and shape the course of the laws that govern technology. Because I know the government looking inward is clear about how it feels about its electronic containers. And so it creates laws that say, these are the cases in which you must provide access as a matter of process to all these electronic containers. If I said to Jay, I'm sorry, there's evidence of police corruption, but it's on this phone, and I'm not going to give you the key, he'd say, I hope, there's a lot of laws that require you to unlock it. And that's because, at least as far as the government goes, we've seen that we just don't buy into the idea that there's this extension of the human mind that's a phone or a cloud, and we want to inspect government records. we write laws that demand the production of a key and the inspection of the records. So the question is, does that sensibility then translate over to people who probable cause exists were involved in criminal enterprises? And so, you know, I think ultimately this idea, I think the law, nothing is as vain as the law, said a lawyer. And the law does not, I'm serious, it's a quote from the New York Review of Books about the show, The Making of a Murderer. They were doing a review of it, and it stuck with me that the saying that nothing is as vain as the law, and I think that is the case everywhere, in every country, and I think that jurisprudential systems around the world won't take well to being told that there are containers that are just not subject to search given judicial process. I think the law just frankly won't stand for that. So the first philosophical question is deciding whether or not these containers are, in some really meaningful way, an extension of the human mind that has Fifth Amendment implications. And if that's not the case, if they are seen as a matter of philosophy in the law to be conventional containers, then I think what we'll see is legal systems around the world coming to a common understanding of the means by which we expect the inspection of those containers to become a technological reality. So I just think that's where things stand for me. I know that's not body cameras. So thank you for indulging me on that. I'd love to hear what people think. Second thing, body cameras, briefly. I want to go into one small thing, one slightly larger thing. The small one is an obvious one. It's just that in Vermont and in many jurisdictions, there's a fundamental tension between two things: transparency and accountability, that one bucket, and then privacy. I think that one of the things that folks like ACLU, Jay Diaz, myself, trying to take seriously is the best way to strike the balance between this public record that gets created constantly every day across a jurisdiction that uses body cameras, and the need to protect the non-probative records that are created through the use of body cameras. You know, so my cops want to know they're always running, and they always have 30 seconds of or at least a minute of backup. So if you press the activation button, it starts recording sound from that moment on, and video. But it's been recording video for up to a minute before. They ask these obvious questions like, what if I'm going to the bathroom? What if I'm having, or you know, what if I'm in a police cruiser and the phone rings and it's a car stop, it's not an emergency situation, and my son calls and he wants to talk about, you know, a very sensitive issue with the family, do I get to mute the camera? Or on the other hand, and this is a more fertile topic for discussion, if I want to have an in-camera conversation, no pun intended, with a fellow cop about, you know, this guy's a drug addict and I want to cut him a break, and I want him to know, but I want him to take us seriously, and I'm getting sick of talking to this guy, and they say something emotional and spontaneous and not, you know, and they're not in the presence of the subject, they're not in the presence of the public, it's a private conversation. Do they get to then mute the camera? Or does the public just get to see everything like a naked lunch, what's on the end of every police officer's fork every day, constantly? And that's a question of what we expect of our body cameras, and it's a legitimate question. I remind you that very few other employees have to carry around a camera and tape every single thing they do constantly and make it open to public inspection. So that kind of brings me into the last point, which I think is a really interesting one as far as the prior review of body camera footage goes in cases where police officers may have criminal exposure. And so one of the important accountability mechanisms of body cameras is that they may stand to capture cases where police officers have criminal exposure. So here's what you have. You have the state saying, hey, if you want to be an employee of the state, you have to wear a surveillance device and surveil yourself during the entire time of your work. And there's a series of regulations by which you have to conduct self-surveillance, but we definitely want you to conduct self-surveillance anytime you're doing something at the context of which would be a crime where you're not doing it under the color of law. When you're doing something that under the normal course of human conduct would be a crime, but you're doing it under the cover of law, it's a demand of your employment that you surveil yourself. Then you have an allegation that's made, it's a shooting or an act of excessive force. The state attorney general gets involved. He or she says, we're going to consider whether to indict you or whether to bring charges. Now what the state does is seizes that surveillance device. And so the question now for the government and for the court is, what is the obligation of the citizen? And I remind you, and it's something that gets lost in the mix, every police officer, when they come under jeopardy of indictment or or a trial or being charged, it's not that they don't take off the cop's uniform and put it in jail. It's a United States citizen that is incarcerated for having committed a crime if they're found guilty. So all of the rights, the very, very basic ones, Fifth Amendment, Fourth Amendment, they all obtain to every police officer. As a side note, when we get frustrated watching cops who we may believe are guilty of something win at trial, I just remember that oftentimes what they're doing when they prevail at trial is following the best legal advice that you would give to a defendant who is undergoing any similar trial about when to make statements, what to say, whether to testify or not, what to object to. We just wish that every other American had the right to the expert legal counsel that police officers get when they're subject to defense. But when you look at a lot of the defense maneuvers that police officers under trial take, it's the ones that a robust defense attorney, a robust defense would require. And I think that's something that we have to work through in policing. But let's get back to body cameras. So the question now is, state orders you to self-surveil, takes a particular interest in self-surveillance in cases where you may have committed a crime, then seizes the device and then says, now what? Offer a criminally admissible statement about what you've done without having seen this evidence? I mean, frankly, I think that's a non-starter. I think that this will be litigated one day, and I think that we can't compel a police officer to make a criminally admissible statement without having had the opportunity to discover with counsel and review the evidence that the state ordered her to surveil herself and collect and then seize from her without review. Now, we also have this interest in policing because it's not just a standard defendant. There's a lot of other people, the public, the person that was the victim of force, the victim in a crime that the officer may have been defending the other person from, who have an interest in this proceeding. It can't just stall because the officer won't make a statement, right? So we don't want officers to say every time there's criminal exposure, you seize the device, you demand to make a statement, I take the fifth. So we also have these institutional pressures and rules in place to demand some sort of statement. One of the ways we cut it is by having the officers who did not fire, who were witnesses, make statements. It may be, if once we come to believe that they would not be seen as possible defendants, saying you have to make statements before you review this surveillance footage. But I think you're getting the gist here, and I'm just saying the same point again and again, that the idea that this is probative evidence in a possible criminal proceeding that the state attorney general is going forward with, and that you may well be a defendant, that you have a right to counsel and every other right, and that there exists this surveillance that you were compelled to take of yourself, I think precludes us from preventing the prior review of body camera footage for the officer who's under criminal suspicion. And I think we just have to work through that. And I think going back up to 10,000 feet, there's something you may be familiar with, this philosophical concept called the Panopticon, right? Jeremy Bentham designed a prison. The prison is like a circle like this, and all the cells are on the outside of the circle, and there's a tower in the middle of the circle. It would have been helpful to have a slide. And the wardens are in the middle of this circle, and they're watching everyone in their cell. The cells have no walls facing inward. And so what Jeremy Bentham said is there just comes a point where you can put these guards behind one-way mirrors, and the prisoners won't know when they are or aren't being watched. And there'll come a point where you can call the prisoner to account for his or her conduct, them making the presumption that a warden was watching them, but they just don't know. They don't know the extent of the surveillance. They don't know what the surveillance of the warden's caught. All they see is a one-way mirror. They know that they have the capacity to be under constant surveillance, but they don't know what it shows. So I think that the police body camera regime that we're rolling out across the country is a particular case of a more serious issue to consider in America and in cases and places with lots of surveillance going on, which is what do we owe to citizens when citizens now have a presumption that they could be under surveillance in one of 50 ways. The cop doesn't know what that body camera footage actually caught, what angle it was at, what it saw, what the lighting conditions were. That's not much different than an everyday American walking down the street, being filmed in Times Square from a million different angles, and then being compelled to give an account to the state without knowing what evidence the state has collected. In a criminal case, it's pretty clear that person walking through Times Square won't have the opportunity or be required or have the option of making a statement until they've conferred with counsel and discussed the evidence that the state has. But the million-dollar question is, to what extent do we want the Panopticon of surveillance that Jeremy Bentham envisaged a few hundred years ago to be the prophylactic regime of American law enforcement, right?
Thank you very much, Chief Diaz. Chief.
Cut off.
Mr. Diaz, if you'd like to.
So I have just
Briefly, please.
Yeah, I have a couple of things I just want to talk about in terms of what data and policing looks like today. But after Chief Del Pozo speaks about body cameras, I want to just put a few questions out, and maybe we can talk about them later. One is, what is a police officer? When they are acting, what are they? Are they individuals or are they the state? Question number two, we talk about a panopticon over law enforcement. Who are the guards in that scenario? Are they an evil eye or are they the public? And then finally, I would ask, when we talk about law enforcement getting to look at footage, officers getting to look at video of what they have done before making a statement in a police investigation, do all defendants have that right? So those are just some questions I put out there. Now, to talk about the broader implications of data and technology in policing, is a very broad topic, and we're gonna keep it mostly to body cameras, but I wanna just let you know about a wide array of technology that is being used around the country, and some of it in Vermont, or previously in Vermont, that is used by law enforcement that you may not know about or that is done without your consent. First, we talk about, in the ACLU of Vermont has done a lot of work on this, automated license plate readers, cameras on our roads that capture our license plate and can basically show where we were at a given time. Is that something we want? And police access that data as a part of investigation without having any strong requirements that they have to go get a warrant. Two, facial recognition technology. The ACLU of Vermont had, Vermont actually had a statute that said that type of technology could not be used on licenses. So facial recognition technology, meaning a picture that can now be identified with your image anywhere else, so that if you are seen in one picture somewhere, it can be run back to your license and you can be identified in that way. It's nationally available, and most states' Department of Motor Vehicles now have this technology and scan, when you go get an ID, scan your face, and then it's accessible to law enforcement agencies around the country, and not just law enforcement agencies, actually. In Vermont, we had a law against this. It was implemented anyway by our DMV. When we found out about it and investigated, we wrote a letter to the governor and asked that it be stopped. Because information, your face print, and all of us have had our face prints done at this point, were being shared with federal law enforcement agencies, immigration agencies, tax divisions of various states, the Agency of Natural Resources, various local police agencies, and there were no limits, basically. Another type of technology that has been obviously in the news a lot is just the general NSA surveillance technology, which the Snowden revelations have taught us a lot about. I won't go into detail, but the idea that basically everything you write, everything that, because it's all sent around the world, essentially everything done on a computer is captured by our government, spy agencies. Is something we all need to take note of. The last one I'll mention is that there is a move toward kind of blanket general surveillance of given communities. I think it was in Maryland that they were doing, they had blimps flying over Baltimore and at all times. And so when a crime occurred, they could look at the blimp's footage and trace back everything that happened before the crime in an attempt to try to find who committed the crime. The problem, of course, is that they're also tracking everything else everyone's doing, and how that can be abused. So I think a lot of, and all of that is without a warrant, of course. So when we think about technology and accountability and surveillance and the violation of constitutional rights, we need to understand that a lot of this is getting way ahead of the law, and the law does not catch up well, unfortunately. But if we act preemptively on a lot of this stuff, we can hopefully have a say in what happens in the future. I'll talk a lot more about body cameras in terms of the questions, because there's a lot of questions that could be asked and will be asked. So I'll leave it at that for now, and allow Jose to speak.
I won't go too long. My name is Jose Maldonado. I'm a retired New York City police officer. Did about 10 years in the 7.5 PSA2, which the chief will tell you is a pretty bad place. When I joined, there was really no body cameras. So this is something that's a recent trend in the New York City Police Department. But it shows you how fast they're catching up to speed. They're gonna have about 36,000 police officers in New York City having body cameras by the end of the year. So that's a good thing. But one of the quick questions I'll pose to you guys is to think about not just the body cameras that are used, but where is this information going to be stored? And what the New York City Police Department is going towards is they actually use a camera called VMU, and they had a chance to use Axon cameras, which was a division of Taser, and they were offering about 1 year to all police departments in the country to use them for free, and then after that they would pay for it. But that would link to a storage site which is called evidence.com. And the NYPD didn't want to do that. They actually wanted to, have their own, control their own things. And that's one of the things I wanted to pose to you, is to think about where a lot of this information is being stored. And there's a lot of issues, a lot of legal issues with that, especially with these small departments around the country that don't have the NYPD resources. And these things are going on around in all these cities and throughout the country. So that's real quick, that's all I wanted to say. And I'll throw it back to you, Michael.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. I suppose my first question is probably more so applicable to Chief Del Pozo. It seems that the different departments in Vermont, they have the discretion to either adopt body cameras or dash cams or not do it at all. What specifically goes into choosing whether to implement body cameras, and what sort of a process does any particular department go through? Clearly, you can speak to Burlington, but maybe you can answer it more generally.
Yeah, the Burlington Police Department started adopting body cameras after the shooting death of a man named Wayne Burnett. Before I came to Burlington, do you know what year it was, Jay? It was 2013, maybe?
Yeah, 5 years ago.
Shootings are very infrequent in Burlington, both police involved and non-police involved. But he was an emotionally disturbed man with a shovel. And in the effort to increase transparency and to assure the public that there'd be better review of incidents like that, the Chief Shirling, adopted body cameras. The thing to understand about Vermont is how unique it is, not only in New England, but throughout the country. The average police department, I'm just going to get this figure wrong, but in Vermont, it might be 10 officers, 5 officers. Burlington, with 102 officers and 150 employees, is the second biggest agency total, next to the state police, largest municipal agency, yet smaller than nearly any NYPD police precinct, and there's 78 of those. So to answer your question succinctly, I just think it's two things that influence it. One is the demand, and the demand for accountability in places outside of, frankly, Burlington is very diffuse and limited. I mean, small police departments in predominantly small towns and rural jurisdictions just don't have this burgeoning citizen demand for transparency and accountability. And the second thing is money. To do it well, you need, one of the things that evidence.com from Taser does as a value proposition internally for shareholders is just charge 500%. They don't own a single server. They charge for storage, but it's not their storage. It's pass-through storage from like Microsoft Azure or Google, and it's expensive. So they say it's CJIS compliant and it's in the cloud and you can access it at any time. It works in Burlington. We have the money for it. We started with grant money, but just to end this thing, demand, and then can we afford this? And the economies of scale of a 5-person or 10-person police department for a camera program are not good. So most agencies just either have a half solution or they don't have the cameras.
All right, this one is directed towards Mr. Diaz. What are the benefits of having body cameras or dash cameras, or is there is one more beneficial than the other for any particular reason?
So the benefits, by and large, are, at least in theory, accountability for law enforcement actions. So we are able to, if something goes wrong, if there's a claim of misconduct, there's the potential to hold an officer to account. Because you can now see what happened. I mean, for a long time, people have, I think the term that's been used in the popular lingo, testifying, have challenged officers' testimony on the stand because most people, or at least a lot of times, it's recognized that officers tend to shade the truth at best. Not all, but some do. And I think it's been shown time and time again enough that we can say it's certainly something that does happen, and this helps us. Body cameras help us to check that. And that's the general sense about our government, how it acts, that when a government officer, a government official acts, we should be able to check that as a citizenry, because it's been shown time and time again that a government without accountability and without transparency is free to test a lie, so to speak. Now, there are other benefits, I think, for the public and for law enforcement, actually. When someone makes a false accusation against them, it's able to be shown when that comes up in court. It's going to be harder for a defendant a defendant as well to shade the truth. So it really does get at the truth, hopefully. I think we, in a sense, it can preemptively prevent problematic behavior by potential defendants or suspects and law enforcement, because they know it could come out later. Although that hasn't always been the case, and we've seen some recent examples of that not working. And so, I think that there are some benefits there. When it comes to dash cams, I think it's it's hard to say what's better. Dash cams are obviously are in the vehicles, usually facing frontward only, and they have a limited range of view. They obviously don't move around, and so they're only capturing one steady angle, whereas the officer could end up off footage and you don't see what's going on. Whereas a camera that's worn on the body, you do see a lot of what specifically is happening. Those can also be covered up, and sometimes when an officer, for instance, is holding, has raised their firearm, it sometimes covers the camera. So in the exact instance where we want to ensure accountability, sometimes it's impossible depending on the placement of the body camera. Also, body cameras tend to be able to be turned off and on, or can be. In Burlington, they're turned off and on at an officer, largely within an officer's discretion. So for instance, where officers are engaging a suspect, the camera goes on immediately. But if they're stopping and having a discussion amidst the suspect being there, but not sure if they're going to arrest the person, the camera goes off. So then we don't know what that discussion is, which is obviously very important to understand why the person why what happens next happens. So I think, we need to be careful. That kind of discretion is not as available in dash cams. In a lot of instances that I've seen, both, officers have claimed, oh, my mic wasn't working, it was broken, I hit the button, but it didn't turn on. So, there are these inherent problems to these systems that still have to be worked out and require strong policies with serious disciplinary measures if we're going to ensure that this is going to be an accountability tool.
Thank you very much. This is for Jose, but I want to each of you to respond or get a chance to respond any way you like. Do you think that that body cameras are the best way to go to ensure lower instances of police misconduct? Or is it merely just an evidentiary tool that has the maybe added benefit of, on occasion, preventing police misconduct?
Yeah, I think most of the police officers, when I left, retired, this was something that was going on in the police department, and for the most part, and you hear it a lot with a lot of B cops, a lot of people. I was in special ops, so you get involved in a lot of different things. You get sued sometimes, but most cops will tell you that body cameras are a great thing. They help to cut down on lawsuits. Sometimes people lie. People will bring you false allegations, and it's really a helpful tool. And one of the things too that we talk about a lot of criminal liability with police officers, but there's another thing too, is like departmentally, you could be under discipline too if something doesn't, you use excessive force, or there's other different things that you could violate, in any police department across the country. So those things will also help when you have the body camera and they bring them up into, the proceedings. You bring it to your representative and say, listen, I have footage of this, and that really helps out. But most of the cops that I have been in contact with are really, supportive of the body cameras and how the department is going. And I think that's probably true around the country.
I think, from the ACLU's perspective, we are largely agnostic on body cameras because we only actually support body cameras where they are used for accountability purposes. And to make that possible, you need strong policies and pretty tight disciplinary regime to ensure that they're not used for showpieces, for something that we can say that there's accountability, but it's really not there. When like as I said before, when an officer can turn their camera on and off at their discretion, it's going to be hard to say that you can get real accountability there. When we don't have a good sense of if the audio is off during a certain time, and we don't have a good sense of what's really going on because it's all about what's being said, not what's on the actual, like, in front of the person on the camera, that isn't going to allow us the accountability that we need. So there's also an important need for body cameras to protect the privacy of public of citizens. So making sure that there are policies around in preventing general surveillance through the use of body cameras, as well as the use of certain technologies like facial recognition technology to examine body camera footage.
I think Jay summed it up really well. Only thing I'll add is, he said, we support the use of body cameras for accountability. I do as well. We could go down a rabbit hole, and it would be an interesting one about, what that means as far as policy goes. I think a lot of the points he makes are very valid. I also support them for the collection of evidence against suspects.
Thank you very much. What are some of the drawbacks to the use of body cameras? It seems like there's a lot of benefits, but what are some situations where you say, well, we don't want to have the body cameras on the police officers? Generally, not like a situation where it's a private talk and you turn it off real quick. Something general.
Yeah, I mean, and the chief can speak to this as well. There's obviously complexity involved here. So, when an officer is engaged with a victim of a crime, should that be recorded is just a big question. And so there are some philosophical questions here. And if that is recorded, should it then be released, to a defendant's counsel or to the public as a public record? I mean, these are important questions that need to be looked at by policy. But I think that that's, one of the biggest drawbacks is that it sounds easy up front to put a camera on every police officer, and we'll get we'll have fewer police shootings or fewer police use of force, or maybe less crime in general. But I think it's a little more complex than that, and we're still working through it. Only 25%, as far as I know, of agencies actually have body cameras in the country. That percentage is much less in Vermont, I'd say. So this is still a new area that's still developing.
Yeah, I think that so privacy and transparency are really coming face to face in this issue. It's interesting for me, just to, we'll know generally, I typically when I'm out in uniform, I don't wear a body camera, and it's not because I'm afraid of what I'm doing as a chief, it's just I'm tired of the city council saying, is that thing on? Because I just want to talk to you. And that kind of speaks to the point that police officers' interactions may be less personal and more tinny, knowing that they, if I pointed a camera in your face and said, now engage in this really difficult transaction with a high emotional content with some other person and make a decision about their fate, and I just followed you around with that camera, it would definitely affect your, it's the Heisenberg principle, it would affect your behavior. And I know, me as a police chief, I have a lot more, in the conduct of my largely political and policy work, I have a lot more productive conversations with people who know that I'm not filming them. And I think that that's just a concern that we can generalize, right? Is the tenor and quality of interactions with victims and witnesses and the tenor of police conduct, not misconduct, but just how they relate to people as human beings is affected by the camera. And it has maybe some negative consequences we want to work through.
Yeah, I think also, you also have to take in the human element of it too. You have people that have been on the job too for 15, 20 years, and have to, maybe they get used to doing things a certain way. And, they're gonna have to learn this new technology. So that's something too, I think that, have to bring people up to speed in a lot of police departments. As like the chief can attest, in New York City, you have people that are on there 15, 20, 25 years, and then they're gonna have to learn something new, and sometimes people can get stubborn with that. So, but like I said, it's a good tool, and I think, it's the way police departments are going.
Thank you. My next question relates to privacy issues in terms of police cameras that are not body cameras and also not dash cameras, it's merely mounted in specific locations around cities, say, for example, light poles and whatnot, that aren't necessarily trying to record a police interaction, but just recording the public generally, but they're owned and monitored by police forces. Where do we draw the line between what's necessary for police to operate and solve crimes and prevent crimes and just being the big brother state? Anyone can take that one.
No, I have strong feelings about this. If you go to England, there are cameras everywhere all the time, and they don't seem to be, maybe that's why they're, you can make some stereotypes about the English, about having stiff upper lips, but I don't think it's because they're constantly under surveillance. It's interesting to see how it works out there. Personally, I don't think it's, and I'll say this not just here and then change my story elsewhere, I don't think it's great to be living in a place where there's cameras everywhere recording everything you do constantly all the time. It violates I have a whole philosophy of privacy that I won't bore you with, but I spent a long time thinking about it, and constantly recording people's private moments is not part of what I think makes a good philosophy of privacy. However, I was out in Chicago a few months ago in an area that was literally on fire with homicide. It was the #1 cause of death of the people in that neighborhood from age 10 to 34 was just getting killed violently. And there was a strategy to help reduce that by putting out cameras that were monitored by a command center. Baltimore, where the blimps were flying, has the #1 homicide rate, really, of any large city in the U.S. And if I take that back, it's definitely the highest it's ever been now. So I think it's important, in closing, to understand surveillance is definitely not an unalloyed good. And also, its value propositions aren't always clear. So I think we need to understand, in given cases, what the value proposition is. And one of the ironies is that communities of color, poor communities, these are the communities where America's violence takes root and where it's hardest to root out. So if we come forward with the value proposition that we want to reduce the violence by surveillance, what we're doing is just compounding. It may be genuine, but then we have this collateral consequence of our poorest communities and our communities of color are also the most surveilled and also the ones with the most government intrusion in their lives. And that's not a new problem. That problem existed in the 7.5 and the 6.7, where it just cops on foot were much more prevalent in those areas. And the value proposition was crime reduction. So I think we need to know when to stop. When crime goes down, we don't just keep the cameras there. We need to cash in on our peace dividend. We also need to understand, as researchers, how does this surveillance program really reduce crime? reduce morbidity and mortality in some like measurable public health type of way, not just it's obvious that surveillance reduces crime. I think those are the things to think about.
So two things quickly. I'm not convinced that surveillance actually does reduce crime. I think it can have an impact when it is initially introduced, but like with body cameras, when someone is recorded regularly and for a long period of time, you forget about it. You forget about the camera. It's, if anyone here has ever watched The Real World or any of these like reality shows, like after a little while, the people settling into the place, they just forget and they start acting just as they did in their regular life. So I think that, I'm not convinced of that, and I do think it needs more rigorous study. The second piece is that what we know is that whenever there is permanent surveillance in place, it will be abused. That has been shown time and time again. We could talk about that with regard to NSA surveillance. We could talk about that with regard to the CCTV system in London. And it is abused, as the chief said, typically with regard to the most marginalized populations. You think about what was going on in New Jersey for Muslim American communities and elsewhere. We have to be very cautious before we put any kind of permanent surveillance in place.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that too, when working in public housing too, that's in New York City. They have a lot of cameras on the rooftops, in the vestibules, in the doorways, outside. So there's a constant level of surveillance in poor communities, but also the surveillance. You look at it too with like what happened in Boston with the bombings, how they were able to finally find it. Even recently with Austin, there was no leads until they found this camera with the person and FedEx. And so these type of things also, you're balancing two different things, whether and this is always a constant pull between privacy concerns and trying to police and trying to catch the bad guys. So that's another thing to consider with all this.
Can I just very briefly, I think you made a great point, and I'd like to drive it home that there has to be some strategy to deliver public safety. And one of the things that you see emerging in the literature is the collateral consequences of proactive policing, whether it's broken windows or stop, question, and frisk or having cops on every corner. Then the alternative to that is, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, reactive policing, which is, we're gonna have a lighter touch up front, preserve rights, but when crimes do happen, investigators will effectively investigate them, take them seriously, not necessarily incarcerate, that's certainly an option, but treat, divert, whatever. Then you need to have a reactive plan that has the right evidence at the right places in the right times. And time again, body camera, surveillance footage has been part of effective investigations. They went to every place that sold nails in Texas until they found an image of the bomber buying some nails at a Home Depot. And it was the body camera footage that really made that possible. So it's all about, sorting through all of this.
Body camera footage or?
No, I'm sorry. Surveillance camera footage at the Home Depot. Thanks, Jay.
So one quick thing about this is like there are cameras in a lot of private locations, private stores, are welcome to have security cameras. And I think, we need to recognize the difference between that and the state putting surveillance technology in public places.
Sure.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have a couple of questions from the audiences that we can take for a quick second.
Yeah, go for it.
I think Cynthia had the first one.
Hello, my name is Cynthia, and I, prior to coming to law school, worked with 3 precincts in New York City, their domestic violence units, and my question comes to the effect of, yes, it's wonderful that we're moving towards body cameras and cameras within police officers' vehicles, but one of the issues that we had within the domestic violence community was the fact that police officers weren't putting in their domestic violence incident reports, their DIRs on time. And then further to that, applicants of VAWA, who were the Violence Against Women and Girls Act, were trying to get a change of legal status, right? And one of the issues that they were facing was the fact that there was a lack of properly documenting the incident that occurred. So I think it's wonderful that we're moving forward, but how are we gonna hold those who are not trying to move forward with the era and who might not even be doing it correctly in the first time in terms of documenting? How are we holding them accountable? And are we gonna hold them accountable?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jose and I have probably taken hundreds of DIRs in our time. You know, you maybe miss home a little bit. What 3 precincts were you in?
23rd and PSA 5.
So it's like northern Manhattan, very dense area. I mean, I don't want to, there was a scandal about this, that officers just were not, you know, they're not complying with this basic regulation about properly recording incidents of domestic violence. There's a very, very strict protocol about domestic violence on paper that even if I show up at a door and no one's home and I knock on it, and Jose knows what I mean, but the radio run said a man and a woman were fighting and they're husband and wife, but they're gone. We still have to fill out a domestic violence report for the incident. And it is, I'm not defending it is very onerous. I think it's a problem of police administration that officers were required to fill out a DIR for every little thing, rightfully so, to establish patterns and see who's at risk. And they just weren't doing it. They were cutting corners. There wasn't a good audit. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true, you know, and a lot of times, as you will know, Cynthia, that, you know, in the precincts, you know, you see how swamped these domestic violence unit is. It's just so many reports they got to go through. Maybe they're understaffed, you know, there's certain cops doing it. So yeah, it's an issue there, and you know, you hope that the supervision gets better, but it's a huge problem, especially in big cities, you know, not just New York, but, you know, especially in, like, you know, Chicago and all these other places around the country, so.
Professor Sand?
Hi, thank you to all of you. My question is a slightly different spin on what you've been talking about already, and that is I'm wondering if you can comment on the interplay between the so-called code of silence or blue code of silence, the perception or the reality that law enforcement officers are not willing to testify against their fellow officers, and the need for some objective recording of what actually transpired.
I think Jose, I'm not trying to punt it. He was in a very, the 7-5, Jose's right, was a very, very challenging precinct with a very insular culture.
Yeah.
It's still one of the most violent precincts in the city, even though it's all much safer now. Maybe you can.
Yeah, and especially, you know, the chief worked in IB, so I mean, he knows too. There's a lot of oversight. I think with, you know, you talk about the blue wall of silence and what body cameras do. I think that's important to have body cameras for that reason, because you're going to see the cameras don't lie, obviously. And, you know, the camera's going to be recording, and if something's, you know, whether it's excessive force or something that happens, and then a complaint is made, because there's one of the things too, anytime somebody calls IAB or anytime somebody calls, you know, whatever, you know, internal affairs the city has, it's going to be logged in, and they're going to have to investigate. And if there's evidence to substantiate, listen, this is what happened, you know, the person that's calling is making a credible allegation against this police officer, they're going to bring every officer in the scene. That's not, they're going to bring the sergeant, they're going to bring the lieutenant, whoever was there, the officers responding. I've testified, and you're going to go down and you're going to face, you know, questions. And believe me, it's not fun to go down, and, you know, you're going to have to be, you know, interrogated about what's going on, and, you know, you better make sure your memo book's up to date and all this other stuff. So these things, you know, I think with the body cameras and more departments are using it, I think it's a big thing to break any sort of corruption that will happen in any police department. So.
Yeah, I think 2 things to think about. The unions are a big influence in this. I'm involved in the, member of the National Advisory Committee for Early Intervention for the Chicago Police Department, where we're trying to build systems with Chicago Crime Lab that will detect and then intervene on officers whose conduct is deteriorating. The biggest obstacle in any case like that is the labor union. One of a labor union's main goals, they have 3 goals. 4, get people paid as much as possible, have them do as little work as possible, and protect them as much as possible from discipline and termination, and also just perpetuate the union leadership. And that's not a bad thing. I'm saying we need that in factories and in you know, cases where management abuses labor, but that rationale makes it harder in policing to discipline officers. I'll just say in closing, I think New York City, having worked in internal affairs, the resources we have in large police departments, as long as the union doesn't get too much in the way, are extraordinary. The resources we had in IAB, I can talk about them in a sidebar, were amazing. I worry more about the smaller police departments where allegations of corruption are investigated by someone's immediate supervisor or their chief, and there may only be a dozen people in the department to begin with, and they don't have body cameras and record keeping or a big budget. I think that's where a lot of the blue wall of silence can most easily continue.
I just want to add quickly, you know, part of that question is really about accountability, and whether, I mean, I wonder whether officers do think, you know, if I don't say something and you don't say something, nobody's going to know, because nobody, and I think the reason for that is nobody from the public gets to look at the records. There is, you know, broad confidentiality in union contracts as well as in statute for police, for misconduct investigations. So taking the state police, which is at least the one that has a statute around it, the state police, when they do an investigation into one of their own, which is problematic in and of itself, you know, those records, those investigations then go to the State Police Advisory Commission, but that advisory commission, and the records are confidential unless one of those members, one of those 3 or 4 people, you know, think it's in the public interest that they be released. I'm not aware of that ever happening. In fact, I know that one of the people on that commission represents law enforcement in police misconduct allegations and court cases. So it's like a little bit fishy sometimes. And I think, you know, broader civilian oversight, broader awareness of these investigations might have an impact on the blue wall of silence.
Cody?
Hi, Cody Stryker, 3L. My general question is, at what point does the Panopticon sort of end? I mean, it's ironic and interesting that Bentham and Foucault used this idea of the Panopticon to attack power systems in place such as police, the military, prisons, and now the public is using it to attack the state in a way that they're scared of their invasion of privacy. And Mr. Diaz makes a great point about using it in public places versus a Home Depot. And I think one really pertinent example right now is the danger of an authoritarian state and not being able to protest in public places without feeling the need to wear a mask. So, you know, at what point, what is the end goal of putting cameras on every single cop out there? I feel like it doesn't really address the problems of gun violence, let's say. So at what point does it end?
Yeah, listen, I'm glad I try to go without bringing up Foucault, but you went there. So, but you make a great point, Cody. One of the things that, to further blur the line, is a lot of people who install cameras in private public places, like a store, right? It's privately owned, but a substantial number of people have access to it. They want the police to be able to get a live feed of their camera at any time or to monitor it. I know there's thousands and thousands and thousands of cameras in New York City that are in these private/public places where the part of the deal is they say, police, here's my feed. So it just gets even more insidious. I guess I'll end that by saying we're seeing now, not only with cameras, but Facebook, Twitter. You know, when we talk about regulating police access to social media, I used to remind Barry Friedman, he's a lawyer, runs a policing project at NYU. This is all real and important, but also the threats to American democracy for social media access are not just about the police. It's about capitalism, frankly, about selling that data into whom and what they do with it. So I don't want to end with, I'm going to end with this platitude, but like, whole new world we're in where everything is accelerating and all the data out there is invasive and overwhelming. And young kids just feel it's normal, but people with a little more life experience are kind of reeling from it. And we have to come up with the right regimes, and maybe taking a step backwards technologically might be better for democracy.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I too wish we could roll back the clock a little bit. Just, you know, the Panopticon idea is about, it is an attack on the state, and it is about, maybe not an attack, but about controlling the state and making sure it doesn't control us through surveillance, because that is really possible. You know, I think the idea of an informed and engaged citizenry is, I guess, the reverse Panopticon. I mean, that's what our democracy is about. It's about the public checking the state, being able to see what it's doing, having transparent transparency, because really those records belong to the public, and then being able to use those records to hold the state accountable. So I think that we need to, we've argued about this before, whether this is an apt metaphor for body cameras or not. The second part of your question, and I think what the chief's comments get to is, and I credit the chief because I think you just canceled a contract that was looking at social media and things like this that BPD had been involved in. The use of algorithms and private companies, farming, or basically police agencies contracting with private companies to, scour social media, to look around. Again, this is the type of blanket surveillance that makes abuse possible. Now, and I haven't yet seen that it can be effective. It may be, but we need to consider whether we want that to be possible, or whether we should preemptively say no until it is shown that it is actually effective, worthwhile, and there are safeguards put in place. That's the kind of society I know I want to live in, and so I'm hopeful that if we can preemptively think about some of these things and put restrictions in place to put the burden of proof on those who would seek this kind of technology, surveillance technology, then we can at least have that discussion. If we don't do it preemptively, that discussion never either doesn't take place or takes place much too late.
Professor Latham?
Thanks, Michael. I have a comment and a question. First of all, I want to thank you for joining us, the panelists. This has been tremendously interesting. And my comment is because one of my younger brothers is in law enforcement, and I think that throughout the country, police, sometimes legitimately are constantly criticized. And I just want to say, I cannot think of a more difficult job that there is today than serving as a police officer. Thank you. But my question is, and it's a nice follow-up to Mr. Diaz's comment, and that's about, I think it's called predictive policing. The idea that given our ability to gather and collect and analyze tremendous amounts of data, that it's now potentially possible to identify through an analysis of data who, what, and where crime will occur. And I recently read that Chicago and New Orleans have been involved in this type of conduct through this type of analysis via a third-party vendor. And I like the panelists' thought on this idea, which I think is peripherally related to body cameras, which is basically a form of data collection. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this idea of predictive policing.
I'd like to say one quick thing before I go into that. My intent is not to steal the Panopticon analogy in some perverse way from Foucault and the ACLU. It's to remind folks that where I do agree with my union is that the exposures that a police officer faces in these cases are personal. They're the criminal exposures of a citizen, and it's not the uniform that's incarcerated. And when an officer exercises her power, seizes the Lamborghini that the drug kingpin has, she's not driving it home herself. She's giving it to the state. She's giving it to you guys. Same thing with the assets that they see. Same thing when, there might be personal exercise of power in a vindictive way to give someone a ticket, but the power tends to benefit the state. The liability is always to the person, and I just want to remind folks of that. That's where I come from. But police officers should be held to a higher standard, but it's true because of the powers that they have and the prerogatives, but it's ultimately a personal, corpus of that faces the liability. Predictive policing. So Chicago is using, they have a chief in from Los Angeles who's using some predictive policing models there. I think it's all very nebulous. The value proposition of predictive policing is still really up in the air. One of the big worries I have is that it just reinforces obvious profiles and stereotypes. I can tell you right now, there's 2 neighborhoods in Chicago I can envision where the shootings are going to happen when they happen. And they're black neighborhoods and they're poor, right? I don't need a multi-million-dollar program to tell me that that's where a police officer should go. It's what they do with the community there. Is it helpful or destructive that matters? I think we should be worried more about predictive policing models that point to people in ways that encourage police forces and criminal justice to focus negative resources on those people rather than helpful interdictions, or puts them under scrutiny, or kind of preordains them to them thinking because of an intervention that they're headed towards a life of crime. I think it's more defensible, but a lot less sexy to look at predictive models that talk about broadly where to allocate resources based on location. You don't just want to have cops driving around an entire city at random. You want them to conduct patrols at the places where there's higher levels of crime. But that's not incredibly technologically advanced. I mean, I think we've been using these pin maps and these heat maps since the late 80s, early 90s. And then the question still remains, and it's a sincere question, I'm not sure, is what do you do when you get there? Do you do stop, question, and frisk? Do you conduct vehicle checkpoints? Do you do outreach? Do you gain community trust? So I think that a lot of the predictive stuff is overblown right now. I think the value of it is unproven, and I think the proven stuff is not new.
If I could echo something there, and I think he's going to smile when I say this, ComStat. And what that is in New York is that this has been going on since the 90s as far as, looking at certain neighborhoods that have maybe a rise in, grand theft autos or, burglaries and stuff, and being able to allocate resources to it. And there's a big accountability there that they've been trying to duplicate in a lot of other, because New York obviously had, big reduction in crime. It was the murder capital of the world, in 91 or around there, and dropped to some, very few, in this past couple years. But I think it's been followed in a lot of cities throughout the country. And a lot of this has to do with accountability and what they've been able to do, and bring up certain precincts that have a spike in crime, and being able to say, listen, what's going on over here? Well, how are you addressing this problem? And that goes beyond video cameras. It goes actually to the leadership in each precinct. And I think it's been a model that's been followed throughout a lot of cities in the country.
I echo what both have said here. The only thing I would add is that the biggest issue for us with regard to predictive policing or the kind of algorithmic surveillance that's being done of the internet and social media is the potential to chill First Amendment freedoms. So, and how that tends to impact disproportionately marginalized communities.
We have time for one more question. Rashida's got the microphone. Oh, they both have microphones. Oh no, what do we do? Dan, go for it.
Thanks, guys, for being here. I wanted to follow up on Cody's question a little bit, and then also Mr. Diaz touched on this just as he was finishing up. With the threat of some authoritarian practices and some potential groups or parts of institutions that are not interested in complying with the rule of law, I'm wondering what institutions and processes there are in place to protect against abuses of a burgeoning surveillance state. And if obviously there are watchdogs like the ACLU, but I don't think that they can probably do it all. So with all of this information that the police, various police departments and institutions and NSA have access to, what processes and institutions do we have now that protect against abuse of that information, and what do you see as potential different or more institutions, processes for that purpose?
That's a big question. I mean, first I would say, my fellow panelists up here, they work in law enforcement or have, and they are at least fluent in these subjects. They're thinking about it at least. I think that's an important start. When Burlington's body camera policy, I mean, was it there a real policy before you arrived?
Yeah, there was, but we've revised it a lot.
It's been revised and updated, and there's been ongoing discussion about that. So I think, having an engaged police force on some of these issues is really important. When it comes to the broader use of surveillance technology, I mean, like I've been saying, I think you do need, we as a society need to get ahead of it. The law needs to get ahead of it. It's clear to me that the courts are not able to get ahead of it, so we need to be talking to our legislators and lawmakers to get ahead of it. As I said, because it's, in a certain sense, some of the stuff is common sense and it's not necessary to be doing, and furthermore, it's not proven to actually work, and can be done without broad surveillance technology. And then secondly, the onus should be on the people who want to use such technology. And this goes for the private sector as well. There needs to be, I prefer, and I think the ACLU would prefer, that society be asked to opt in, not have to opt out after the fact, without notice.
Rashida, where'd you go? Oh, there
right
you
here.
are.
I'm about to throw it to Brittany on this question.
Okay. This is actually just a brief comment. I prosecute for 2 police departments in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, I want to say it was January 1st of 2017, passed a body-worn camera statute that clarified some things. One of the things that the camera footage would not be subject to right to know, which is helpful in terms of investigation, but it's also an interesting piece of the whole thing. But what I wanted to say is my departments are, when they have a full roster, 8 officers, and the other one is 6 officers. They both use Axon. I'm very familiar with evidence.com. They chose to adopt it, and my first chief was one of the first adopters, and I think one of the reasons he did it was to mend his community ties. The police department and the community had been at odds for many years. There was talk of corruption and issues in this small department, and among other efforts he made to mend those ties when he became chief, adopting body cameras was one of them. All of the officers are amazingly good about following the statute, clarifies when they can turn it off and when they can't, and what they have to do if it malfunctions or they turn it off in a situation they're supposed to have it on. So it's great for accountability. It is fantastic for evidence. It helps both defense and myself quickly come to agreement on things. And I've seen that they've gotten very fluid in handling it. Example, called to the hospital for an out-of-control patient, cameras are off because there's medical treatment being done. The medical personnel leave the room because the patient becomes more out of control. Cameras go on, and then my officer is assaulted. So, you know, there's the balance in making sure that a patient's rights are being protected as well. But thus far in both agencies, there's a very positive atmosphere about the cameras from the officer's standpoint, certainly from the chief's standpoint. And I also appreciate that when they're in the moment, there's less concern that they're going to miss a key piece of evidence because their body camera is going while they're trying to interact appropriately with an individual, whether it's a defendant or community caretaking or something along those lines.
Just quickly on the right to know piece, you know, the ACLU nationally has recognized the tension between privacy interests and transparency. And so in their model policies, what they have said is that, you know, right to know, the Public Records Act here in Vermont or FOIA nationally, that should apply really only in situations where there's either a use of force or a complaint. And because the public interest is so high in that instance to ensure accountability, that it outweighs the privacy interests of people involved. So I think that that's, you know, there is a balance to be struck. And I think that it's an interesting one and an important one that is currently still developing here and in other states. But New Hampshire adopting the laws that they did as quickly as they did, National has praised New Hampshire for its forward thinking and really they hewed very closely to the ACLU's models.
We have time for one more question from this little lady right here.
Yes, hi. Pamela Kranak, longtime resident of Burlington. Thank you, Chief Del Pozo, for your leadership there. I just had a quick question about innovations. One of the concerns for women and children who are victims of domestic violence and are some of the largest numbers of homicides in Vermont is most people don't have resources. They don't have the resources of a Home Depot or whatever to put all kinds of surveillance cameras around. And it's very difficult to get responses around Vermont, particularly outside of Burlington, from police. Is there any innovations being pioneered using surveillance technology, face recognition technology to provide a greater level of protection for victims of domestic violence?
So the answer is no, that I know of, but not in a way that should leave you with less hope. We have a dedicated domestic violence officer in the Burlington Police Department. I created that position when we got here, and I'll be candid, just in an argument with one of my lieutenants last night during a performance review where he said cops are complaining that you created a domestic violence officer because you took a patrol officer from the road, and that's more work for everyone. Just a little bit of inside baseball. I've actually grown the size of the police department since I've gotten here from 93 or 4 to 102, authorized 105. That's unprecedented, so there's more cops. And then I also took a training position that was manned by a uniformed cop, put that officer back on the road and put a civilian employee in their place. So I yelled at the lieutenant in a very respectful way, saying you're not following what's going on or doing the math. But more cops than ever, for better or for worse. And a domestic violence officer. I think the biggest problem with domestic violence is not the technology per se, you may disagree, but the trust and the assurance that when a victim reaches out to the police, as you alluded to, that it gets taken seriously, that there's follow-up, that the court takes it seriously, that the proper affidavits are written, that it's not just a piece of paper that's the only thing that's protecting the person from coming into contact with the aggressor again. And when I first put the domestic violence officer in place, exactly what I hope would happen, which is our domestic violence stats went up. If they don't go up, then you're not doing a good enough job, because it means that there's still victims out there that are afraid to come forward. So for about a year and a half, we had more domestic violence on the books than ever before. And then in the last year, they've gone down. It's because this person really doggedly goes to court on each case, writes the affidavits, does follow-ups, does proactive visits with the victims. So I don't have an easy technological answer for you, but I still say that in that gap, there's a tremendous amount of value to still be brought about in this state from just gumshoe detective and police work in protecting the victims of domestic violence.
We do have electronic monitoring, so if people who are arrested for domestic violence, and I don't know if it's statewide yet, and there's problems with how that works, especially in places where there are mountainous regions and GPS technology isn't so good because cell towers don't reach certain areas in Vermont. But where someone is going to be out on bail after a domestic assault, or judges can order electronic monitoring, and so there's an officer or a sheriff somewhere in the state who is basically watching to make sure that the dot doesn't go in a certain radius of where the victim is, so, or where the survivor is. So, so that has been being developed in Vermont. Hopefully it's had an impact. Right. That's correct. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, panel. Give them a hand, everybody.
I do want to say, it's not usual for an ACLU lawyer to sit between two NYPD officers, so it's been fun.
Unless it's in the aftermath of a protest.
I guess we're deferring now to our student leaders if you want to explain what's going to happen next.
Thank you. Thank you again to our panelists and our moderator, Michael. We really appreciate your help. So what's happening next? At 11:15, you guys have a couple of minutes before then. You can grab some coffee and some pastries. We will have our first lab breakout. There are 3 labs, and they're all held in Oaks. Oaks is straight ahead. Just keep walking straight until you hit a dead end. That's Oaks. And our first lab, of the 3 that you guys can choose of, one is GDPR versus USPR, and that is in Oaks 208.